I always believed living on my family's farm meant true freedom. 50 acres of rolling pastures, a creek winding through century-old oak trees, and enough distance from the city to see every star in the night sky. Fair sanctuary from HOAs, nosy neighbors, and the endless rules of suburban life, until the day someone destroyed the bridge that had connected my farmhouse to my barn for over 70 years. The bridge my grandfather built with his own hands, completely demolished without warning. And the culprit? A power-hungry HOA president who didn't seem to care that my land wasn't even part of her precious development. Before I dive into this infuriating story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let me know if you've ever dealt with HOA overreach in your area. Your stories help remind all of us that we're not alone in these battles. My name is Emma Mitchell, and the Mitchell family farm has stood on this land since 1943. My grandfather purchased it after returning from World War II, and it's been passed down through generations. I took over operations 5 years ago when my parents retired to Florida, determined to keep our small heritage farm alive despite the encroaching developments. That Monday morning began like any other. I woke before dawn, made my coffee, and headed out to feed the animals. The footbridge spanning the creek was essential. It connected my farmhouse on the east side to the barn, chicken coop, and main fields on the west. Without it, reaching the animals would require a 20-minute detour around the entire property. I was halfway down my porch steps when I stopped dead in my tracks. Something was wrong with the landscape. The familiar wooden arch of the bridge was missing from its spot across the creek. What in the world? I muttered, setting down my coffee mug and hurrying toward the creek bank. Where my grandfather's sturdy bridge had stood just yesterday was nothing but 2 jagged concrete foundations. The entire structure, wooden planks, railings, support beams, was completely gone. Fresh tire tracks cut deep into the mud along the bank, and scattered pieces of broken wood littered the ground. My mind raced. A flood? No, we hadn't had significant rain in weeks. Vandals? Who would go to the trouble of completely removing a bridge? Theft made no sense. The aged wood had sentimental value but little else. That's when I spotted it, a bright orange notice impaled on a stake near the creek's edge. I snatched the paper, hands trembling with a mixture of confusion and growing anger. Notice of unauthorized structure removal, the header proclaimed in bold black letters. Below it, in smaller print, Willowbrook. Estates Homeowners Association has authorized the removal of non-compliant structures visible from community properties. Questions should be directed to the HOA office. I read it 3 times, unable to process what I was seeing. Willowbrook Estates was the new luxury development that had broken ground on adjacent land 2 years ago. Their pristine rows of matching, craftsman-style homes had been slowly creeping closer to my property line, but we were still separated by a good quarter mile. More importantly, my farm wasn't part of their HOA. I'd never signed any membership papers, never received their bylaws, never paid a penny in dues. My family had owned this land decades before their development was even conceived. I pulled out my phone and took photos of everything. The destroyed bridge foundations, the tire tracks, the debris, and the notice. My hands shook with anger as I realized the full implications. Without the bridge, I couldn't easily access half my property, including the barn where I kept feed, equipment, and most importantly, the animals depending on me for care. Fury building, I trudged the long way, around the creek to check on my livestock. The entire time, questions pounded through my mind. Who authorized this? How dare they trespass on my land? What gave them the right to destroy my property? By the time I finished the morning chores, which took twice as long without the bridge, I had worked myself into a righteous anger. I marched back to the house, notice in hand, and began researching Willowbrook Estates HOA. Their website was sleek and professional, featuring manicured lawns and smiling families. Under leadership, I found her, Patricia Wilkinson, HOA president, beaming in a professional headshot. Something about her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and practiced smile made my skin crawl. I called the HOA office number listed on the notice. After navigating an unnecessarily complicated phone menu, I finally reached a receptionist. I need to speak with Patricia Wilkinson immediately, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. Someone from your HOA has illegally demolished a bridge on my farm property. Oh, the receptionist sounded genuinely surprised. I'll see if Mrs. Wilkinson is available. After a long hold, a crisp, authoritative voice through the speaker. This is Patricia Wilkinson, president of Willowbrook Estates HOA. How may I help you? You can help by explaining why your organization trespassed on my property and destroyed my bridge, I replied, no longer bothering to hide my anger. I'm Emma Mitchell. I own Mitchell Family Farm adjacent to your development, and I am not a member of your HOA. There was a brief pause before Patricia responded, her voice now cool and dismissive. Yes, Ms. Mitchell. The board was made aware of a non-compliant structure visible from several of our premium lots. As per our community standards, we addressed the issue. Your community standards don't apply to my property, I nearly shouted. You had no right. I'm afraid I have another meeting now, she interrupted smoothly. If you'd like to discuss this further, you can attend our next board meeting or submit your concerns in writing. The line went dead before I could respond. Sat there in stunned silence, staring at my phone. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. In that moment, I knew this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. This was a deliberate act, one that would have serious consequences for the person responsible. What Patricia Wilkinson didn't realize was that she had just declared war on the wrong farmer. After a sleepless night spent researching property laws and HOA regulations, I decided a face-to-face confrontation couldn't wait until their next scheduled board meeting. My animals needed access to pasture, and I needed answers. I pulled county records online and confirmed what I already knew. Willowbrook Estates' property line stopped a full quarter-mile from my farm. Their development had been built on the IT, Old Peterson Dairy Farm, which had been sold to developers after the family patriarch passed away. Not an inch of my land fell under their jurisdiction. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when I pulled into the Willowbrook Estates Community Center, an imposing brick building with white columns and perfectly manicured flower beds. The parking lot already held several cars despite the early hour. I'd made an effort to look professional, trading my usual farm clothes for clean jeans, a button-down shirt, and my least scuffed boots. This wasn't about intimidation. It was about being taken seriously. The receptionist glanced up as I entered, recognition flashing across her face. Ms. Mitchell, do you have an appointment? No, but I need to speak with Patricia Wilkinson immediately, regarding the illegal destruction of my property. Before she could respond, a door opened and a woman emerged, tall, immaculately dressed in a cream pantsuit, her blonde hair arranged in an elaborate updo. The same woman from the website, but somehow more intimidating in person. I thought I heard your voice, Patricia said, her smile not reaching her eyes. I'm in the middle of important HOA business, but I can spare 5 minutes. She gestured toward her office and I followed, noting the framed photos of her shaking hands with local politicians and real estate developers. Now, she said, settling, behind a large desk, I understand you're upset about the old bridge removal, but surely you can see this as an opportunity to upgrade to something more appropriate. Appropriate, I repeated, struggling to maintain my composure. That bridge was built by my grandfather. It was structurally sound and entirely on my private property that has never been part of your HOA. Patricia's smile tightened. Several of our homeowners, who paid premium prices for lots overlooking natural landscapes, complained about the eyesore. That rotting wooden structure was visible from at least 6 of our luxury homes. That doesn't give you the right to trespass and destroy it. She waved a manicured hand dismissively. Willowbrook Estates has aesthetic jurisdiction over viewsheds that impact our property values. It's in our expanded bylaws. Aesthetic jurisdiction? I pulled out my phone, opening the County GIS map. Show me where in county law it says your HOA controls land you don't own. Patricia's expression hardened. I don't appreciate your tone, Ms. Mitchell. This could have been handled civilly. Civility would have involved discussing concerns with me before destroying my property. Now I have no way to access half my farm without a 20-minute detour. Perhaps you should consider more appropriate land use given your proximity to an upscale community. Farming is becoming obsolete in this area. The condescension in her voice made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay focused. Who authorized the removal? And who performed the actual demolition? The board approved addressing community eyesores at our last meeting. Precision contractors handled the removal. Very efficiently, I might add. So you hired contractors to trespass on my land and destroy my property without my knowledge or consent? Patricia stood abruptly. I've given you more than enough of my time. If you have further concerns, put them in writing for the board's consideration. This isn't over, I said, standing my ground. That bridge was critical infrastructure for my farm operations. You had no legal right to remove it. Perhaps you should reassess whether a working farm is still appropriate adjacent to our community, she replied coolly. Several developers have expressed interest in your acreage for Willowbrook Phase 3. The implication was clear. This wasn't just about a bridge, it was about pressuring me to sell. My farm isn't for sale, I stated firmly, and I expect full compensation for the bridge replacement, plus damages for trespassing. Patricia's laugh was brittle. Good luck with that. Our HOA has never lost a dispute. You've never destroyed property belonging to someone outside your HOA before? I'm done with this conversation. She reached for her phone. If you don't leave, I'll call security. Don't bother, I replied, heading for the door. I've heard everything I need to. My attorney will be in touch. As I walked out, a man in an expensive suit was waiting to enter Patricia's office. I caught a snippet of their conversation as I passed. Is that the farmer? He asked in a low voice. Don't worry, Patricia replied. She'll sell eventually. They always do. The drive home gave me time to process what had just happened. Patricia's dismissive attitude and thinly veiled threats made it clear this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a calculated move to devalue my property and force me out. Upon returning to my farm, the reality of the situation hit me hard. Without the bridge, I couldn't efficiently move equipment or animals across my property. The morning chores had taken twice as long, and I still needed to figure out how to transport hay to the far pasture without the direct route the bridge had provided. I stood at the edge of the creek, looking at the broken concrete foundations, all that remained of my grandfather's handiwork. The bridge hadn't just been a convenience, it was essential infrastructure for a working farm. My phone buzzed with an email notification. The county's Agricultural Extension Office had responded to my urgent query with confirmation. No HOA had authority over land outside its legal boundaries, regardless of viewshed impacts. I took a deep breath and made 2 calls. First to my insurance company to file a claim for the destroyed property, and then to Emma Lawson, an attorney friend who specialized in property disputes. This battle was just beginning, and I needed allies. As I ended the call with Emma, who promised to meet me the following day, I noticed a sleek black SUV driving slowly past my property. Through the tinted windows, I could make out Patricia's distinctive silhouette, surveying my farm like a general scouting enemy territory. The line had been drawn. Patricia Wilkinson and her HOA had declared war on the wrong farmer, and I was prepared to fight back with everything I had. The morning after my confrontation with Patricia, I set out with a singular purpose, to document everything. My father always said, in a dispute over land, paper speaks louder than words. It was time to let the papers speak. I began at the scene of the crime. Armed with my camera, measuring tape and notebook, I catalogued every detail of the destroyed bridge. The concrete footings, roughly severed, still showed the imprint of the main support beams. I measured the span, 22 feet across the creek, and photographed the tire tracks leading from the nearest access point to my property. They came in through the south field, I muttered, following the deep ruts that cut through my cover. The heavy equipment had careless crushed plants and compacted soil far beyond the bridge area, causing additional damage to my fields. I marked each spot of collateral damage, estimating the affected acreage. This wasn't just about the bridge. They had trespassed across a substantial portion of my farm. My next stop was the county records office, a beige building staffed by the extraordinarily helpful Margaret, who'd worked there since before I was born. Emma Mitchell. Haven't seen you since your daddy transferred the farm to your name, she greeted me. "What brings you in today?" I explained the situation, watching her expression shift from welcome to outrage. "They did what now?" "That's straight-up trespassing. And destruction of property." Margaret shook her head vigorously. "Let's pull everything we've got on your parcel and that development." Within the hour, she had assembled a stack of documents. The original deed from my grandfather's purchase in 1943, subsequent property transfers, survey maps from various years, and the recent subdivision plans for Willowbrook Estates. "Look." "Here," Margaret said, pointing to the official plat map. "This line marks the legal boundary of their development. Your creek isn't even close to their property. There's a good quarter-mile of former Peterson land between you and them." She made certified copies of everything, officially stamped and ready for legal proceedings. As she handed me the folder, she added, "And, just so you know, they tried to include your land in their original development proposal 3 years ago. Your father shut that down quick. This was news to me. They tried to claim my land was part of their development. They submitted plans that showed the creek as their boundary. Your daddy came in with his survey and raised holy hell. They had to redraw everything. So this wasn't the first time Willowbrook had tried to encroach on Mitchell land. The bridge destruction suddenly seemed even more calculated. My next task was documenting the bridge's history. Back home, I dug through our family archives, photo albums, farm journals, and my grandfather's old papers. In a dusty album from 1952, I found it, a black and white photograph of my grandfather, standing proudly on his newly completed bridge. The back of the photo bore his neat handwriting. "Finished the Oak Bridge today, should last generations if maintained properly." There were more photos through the decades. My father as a boy fishing from the bridge, my mother carrying a basket of vegetables across it, me at age 6 sitting on the railing while my grandfather repaired some planks. The bridge wasn't just infrastructure, it was woven into my family's history. I found maintenance records too. My grandfather and father had dutifully documented every repair, every board replacement. The last major renovation had been just 7 years ago, with pressure-treated lumber and reinforced supports. This was no decrepit eyesore, as Patricia had claimed. It was a well-maintained, functioning structure. As the afternoon waned, I drove to visit my neighbor, Harold Jenkins. At 84, Harold had been farming the adjacent property for over 60 years and missed very little that happened in the area. "Been wondering when you'd come by," he said as I sat on his porch. "Saw them taking out your bridge Tuesday morning. Bunch of fellows with heavy equipment and a woman supervising the whole thing." "A woman?" I leaned forward. "Can you describe her?" Blonde hair, fancy clothes, standing there with a clipboard looking like she was directing a Broadway show instead of a demolition. Kept pointing and taking pictures with her phone. "Did you speak with her?" Harold snorted. "Tried to. Asked what they were doing on Mitchell land. She said they had full authorization, and it was community improvement. When I asked who authorized it, she just walked away." I showed him a photo of Patricia from the HOA website. His eyes narrowed. "That's her all right, looking mighty pleased with herself." Harold agreed to provide a written statement about what he'd witnessed. As a respected long-time resident, his testimony would carry weight. My final stop for the day was the local police station. The officer at the desk looked skeptical as I explained the situation. "So you're saying someone from an HOA you don't belong to came onto your property and removed a bridge?" Officer Reynolds repeated. "Exactly. I have photos of the damage, property records proving my ownership, and an eyewitness who saw them doing." Tightly spread the evidence on his desk. The photographs, the property records, Harold's statement, and the orange notice from the HOA. Officer Reynolds' expression changed as he examined the documents. "This is more thorough than most of the reports we get," he admitted. "Let me file this properly." He took my statement, catalogued the evidence copies, and assigned a case number for criminal trespassing and destruction of property. "I can't promise how quickly we can move on this," he cautioned, "but you've got a solid case for civil court regardless." As I drove home, I tallied up the day's progress in my mind. I had detailed documentation of the damage, certified property records proving my ownership, historical evidence of the bridge's existence and condition, an eyewitness account placing Patricia at the scene, a police report establishing an official record of the incident. It was a good start. But I knew this battle was just beginning. Back at the farmhouse, I created a dedicated journal for the case, carefully noting each conversation, each piece of evidence, each expense incurred due to the bridge's absence. I calculated the additional labor hours required to work my farm. Without the bridge, nearly 3 extra hours daily to move equipment and tend animals. I documented the fuel costs for driving the long way around, the stress on livestock from altered routines, and the potential crop losses from delayed field access. As darkness fell, I stood at the edge of the creek, looking across to my inaccessible fields. The practical impact of the bridge's loss was already severe, but tomorrow would bring a new phase in this fight. I had gathered my evidence. Now it was time to find allies. The law office of Granville and Associates occupied a restored Victorian house at the edge of downtown. Inside, the antique architecture contrasted with modern furnishings and technology. Much like my farm, I thought, traditional foundations supporting contemporary operations. Morgan Granville had come highly recommended for property disputes. In her mid-40s, with a no-nonsense demeanor, she reviewed my evidence folder with methodical precision. "This is one of the most blatant HOA overreaches I've seen," she said finally, looking up from the documents. "And I've handled dozens of these cases. So we have a strong position," I asked. "Extremely. They trespassed on land they have zero authority over and destroyed valuable property. The fact that Patricia Wilkinson personally supervised makes her individually liable as well as the HOA." Morgan tapped my grandfather's bridge photos. "The historical and functional value strengthens our case considerably. What's our next step?" "First, a formal demand letter for full restoration of the bridge to its previous condition, plus damages for trespass, lost productivity, and emotional distress. Given the circumstances, I'd suggest we start at $75,000. I winced at the figure. "That seems high. Trust me, it's reasonable considering what they've done, and we'll need negotiating room." She made several notes. "We should also file for an emergency injunction preventing them from entering your property again. Patricia's comment about your land being part of Phase 3 concerns me." As we finalized our strategy, Morgan mentioned something unexpected. "You're not the first farmer dealing with Willowbrook, by the way. I represented Simon Chen last year when they diverted his irrigation water. This was valuable information. Can you put me in touch with him? I'll ask if he's willing to speak with you. In the meantime, start documenting every interaction with the HOA or its representatives. Record all phone calls. We're in a one-party consent state." Armed with legal guidance, my next destination was the County Agricultural Extension Office. Director James Washington had worked with local farmers for decades, helping them navigate everything from crop diseases to development pressures. "I heard about your bridge," he said as I entered his cluttered office. "Word travels fast when an HOA pulls something like this." I explained the situation in detail, while James listened intently, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief. "This is part of a pattern," he said when I finished. "We've had 4 cases in the last year of HOAs attempting to exert control beyond their boundaries, particularly targeting agricultural properties." He pulled out a county map marked with red dots. "Each of these represents a complaint from a farmer about Willowbrook or similar developments. They're using aesthetic complaints, false environmental concerns, even noise ordinances to pressure farmers into selling. Is there anything the Extension Office can do?" James nodded. "2 things. First, I can provide an official valuation of the productivity impact from losing your bridge access. Second, there's a county agricultural protection zoning meeting next month. Your case would make a compelling argument for strengthening these protections." I left with another ally and a plan to address the broader issue beyond my individual case. That afternoon, I met Simon Chen at his vegetable farm 3 miles from mine. Though his operation was smaller, his situation felt eerily familiar. "They redirected the drainage from their new streets to dump into my irrigation pond," he explained, as we walked his property. "Filled it with silt and road runoff overnight. When I complained, Patricia said my unsightly farm pond was now an improved water feature thanks to their contributions. How did you resolve it?" Morgan filed suit. They settled after their insurance company got involved, paid for complete pond restoration and a proper drainage system. Simon stopped, looking across his fields. But Patricia's been finding other ways to make life difficult. Anonymous complaints to the county about equipment noise, sudden concerns about my farm stand's parking. She holds a grudge, I observed. Definitely. But what she doesn't understand is that farmers are the original community organizers. Simon smiled. Which brings me to our monthly meeting. I raised an eyebrow questioningly. Farmers United Against Development Pressure, FUAD for short. We're meeting Thursday at the Grange Hall. You should come. 15 local farmers, all dealing with similar issues. This was exactly what I needed. A community of people facing the same fight. By Thursday evening, the Grange Hall parking lot was filled with mud-splattered trucks and practical sedans. Inside, farmers of all ages gathered around tables covered with maps, documents, and coffee mugs. Simon introduced me to the group, and I briefly shared my bridge situation. The response was immediate and supportive. Classic Patricia tactic, said Maria Gutierrez, who ran a flower farm. She tried claiming my greenhouse violated their viewshed rights, had to get a restraining order to keep her people off my property. Throughout the evening, I collected business cards, phone numbers, and promises of support. Most valuable were the strategies they'd developed, everything from united legal representation to coordinated appearances at county meetings. The key is solidarity, explained Howard Freeman, an elderly apple grower whose family had farmed the area for 5 generations. These developers count on picking us off individually. Together, we're much harder to intimidate. By the meeting's end, I had 5 farmers volunteering to provide statements about their own HOA encounters, 2 offering equipment to help me work around my bridge problem, and 1 retired engineer sketching preliminary plans for a temporary crossing. The next morning, I decided to attend the monthly Willowbrook Estates Open HOA meeting. As a non-member, I couldn't vote or participate officially, but meetings were technically open to the public. I arrived early, choosing a seat near the back where I could observe without immediately drawing attention. Gradually, homeowners filled the room, many glancing curiously in my direction. When Patricia entered, her step faltered slightly upon seeing me before she recovered her composure and proceeded to the front. Throughout her agenda items, I took careful notes on how she operated, the way she subtly directed discussions, dismissed certain homeowners' concerns, and dominated the board members. During the public comment period, I approached the microphone. My name is Emma Mitchell. My family farm borders your community. Last week, someone from this HOA authorized the destruction of a bridge on my private property. I'd like to know who approved this action and why I wasn't consulted. A murmur ran through the audience. Patricia cut in quickly. This isn't an appropriate forum for disputes with non-residents. Please take your seat. Actually, came a voice from the audience, I'd like to hear more about this. A middle-aged man in a button-down shirt stood. If the HOA is operating outside our boundaries, that affects our liability and potentially our dues. Others nodded in agreement. Patricia's smile tightened. The matter Ms. Mitchell refers to involved an eyesore visible from several premium lots that was affecting property values. The board acted within its authority to protect community interests. Was the bridge on HOA property? The man pressed. The aesthetic impact, was it on HOA property? He repeated firmly. The room fell silent, waiting for her answer. The board has thoroughly reviewed this matter, Patricia deflected. Now, moving to our next agenda item, I hadn't expected to gain allies within Willowbrook itself, but as the meeting ended, several homeowners approached me privately. I'm Robert Inouye, said the man who had spoken up. Architecture committee member. If they're removing structures outside our boundaries, that's beyond concerning. Some of us are already questioning certain board actions. I exchanged contact information with Robert and 4 other interested homeowners, potentially adding internal pressure to my growing coalition. As I drove home, I reflected on the day's progress. From legal experts to fellow farmers to concerned homeowners within Willowbrook itself, a network of support was forming. Patricia might have the power of an HOA behind her, but I was building something potentially stronger, a community united by a shared sense of justice and respect for property rights. The bridge battle was evolving into something larger than I had anticipated. This wasn't just about restoring my crossing anymore. It was about establishing boundaries, literal and figurative, that even the most powerful HOA couldn't cross without consequences. 1 week after my confrontation with Patricia, I found a county inspector's truck parked at my front gate. A thin man in an official uniform was taking photographs of my property line. "Can I help you?" I called, approaching with a friendly but cautious demeanor. "Lyle Barnes, County Code Enforcement," he replied, showing his identification. "We received complaints about multiple violations on this property." "Complaints from whom?" "Anonymous," he said, though his uncomfortable expression suggested otherwise. "Allegations of improper waste management, unauthorized structures and livestock too close to a waterway." I wasn't surprised. This had Patricia written all over it. "I'm happy to show you around," I offered. "My farm meets all agricultural zoning requirements." For the next hour, I toured Lyle through my property. He inspected my compost system, properly managed, the chicken coop, fully compliant, and the livestock fencing, well beyond required setbacks from the creek. "Everything looks in order," he finally admitted, completing his forms. "Though, that bridge situation," he gestured toward the demolished crossing, "that was removed without my permission by Willowbrook Estates HOA, I explained. "I filed a police report and am pursuing legal action." Lyle's eyebrows rose. "They removed a structure from your property? That's highly irregular. Would you mind noting the bridge destruction in your report? Another official record would help my case." He nodded, photographing the damaged foundations and adding detailed notes. As he prepared to leave, he hesitated. "Between us, this isn't the first complaint we've received about your property recently. All anonymous, all within the past week. Just be prepared for more visits." "Thank you for the warning." Sure enough, the next day brought another county vehicle, this time water quality control, responding to concerns about agricultural runoff. Like Lyle, they found no violations. 2 days later, noise compliance arrived following complaints about excessive farm equipment operation during residential hours. Each inspection ended the same way, with confirmation that my farm was following all regulations, and with increasingly apologetic county employees who recognized they were being used as harassment tools. Meanwhile, Morgan's demand letter to the HOA had been delivered by courier, requiring signed receipt. The response came 3 days later, a dismissive 2-paragraph letter denying responsibility and suggesting I should consider the community benefits of conforming to evolving neighborhood standards. "They're stalling," Morgan explained during our follow-up call, "trying to wear you down while pushing forward with whatever plans they have for acquiring your land." My security cameras confirmed her theory. Twice that week, I spotted Patricia's distinctive black SUV driving slowly past my property. The second time, she had a man in a suit with her, the same developer I'd seen at the HOA office. Then came the sign. I discovered it early Saturday morning, a large professional placard erected just at the edge of Willowbrook property, clearly positioned to be visible from my land. "Future site of Willowbrook Estates Phase 3. Luxury homes coming soon." The sign featured a glossy rendering of executive homes with manicured lawns, built directly where my fields currently stood. I photographed it from multiple angles, then called Morgan. "They're making a statement," she said, after I described the sign. "Trying to create the impression your farm is already slated for development. It's likely aimed at both you and any potential allies. Is it legal?" The sign itself, yes, as long as it's on their property. The implied claim that they have rights to develop your land? That skirts misrepresentation laws. That afternoon, I received an envelope containing photos of my farm with red circles highlighting supposed violations, a rusting tractor part, a stack of hay bales, the chicken coop. Attached was a note on Willowbrook letterhead. "These unsightly conditions impact neighboring property values. Remediation required within 7 days." I added the letter to my evidence file, noting it contained no actual authority or consequences, just implied threats. The following day brought a new tactic. While shopping for supplies in town, I overheard two women discussing that disgusting farm by Willowbrook and how it was spreading disease and attracting vermin. When I casually approached their conversation, they mentioned hearing this directly from the HOA president. Patricia was spreading rumors about my farm's sanitation. I consulted with James at the Agricultural Extension Office, who suggested a proactive approach. Request an official county agricultural inspection, he advised. Get documentation of your farm's compliance with all health and safety standards. We can even issue a good agricultural practices certification. The inspection was scheduled for the following week, but Patricia escalated again before it could occur. I returned from delivery rounds to find survey stakes with bright orange flags planted along my eastern property line, the side facing Willowbrook. They formed a line cutting 20 feet into my land, effectively claiming a strip of my property as part of their development. This wasn't just harassment. It was a direct challenge to my property boundaries. I carefully photographed each stake without removing them, then called both Morgan and the county surveyor's office. Morgan arrived first, examining the stakes with growing concern. This crosses the line from nuisance to illegal encroachment, she stated, marking the GPS coordinates on her tablet. They're physically staking claim to land they don't own. When the county surveyor arrived an hour later, he confirmed what we already knew. The stakes had been placed well within my property line. This doesn't match any official survey, he explained, comparing the stakes to county records. Whoever placed these had no authority to do so. He provided an official document confirming my property boundaries and noting the unauthorized survey markers, another piece of evidence for our growing case. That evening, I installed additional security cameras covering the staked area and property lines. If Patricia or her contractors returned, I wanted clear video evidence. The next morning brought another development, a letter from the Willowbrook Estates Architectural Review Board citing boundary dispute concerns and claiming development rights based on an updated survey. Attached was a doctored map showing my creek as their property line. Morgan immediately filed for an emergency injunction to prevent any further encroachment, trespassing, or modifications to my property. The court date was set for the following week. As I returned from dropping documents at Morgan's office, I found a group of Willowbrook residents gathered at my roadside farm stand. For a moment, I feared another confrontation, but their purpose was unexpected. "We're here to show support," explained Robert Inouye, the architecture committee member I'd met at the HOA meeting. "Some of us have been researching the board's actions and are concerned about potential liability for all homeowners." He introduced me to 7 other Willowbrook residents who had formed an informal committee investigating Patricia's activities. "We moved here because we loved the rural character of the area," said Eleanor, a retired teacher. "The farm views were a selling point, not a problem. Now we're facing increased dues to fund legal battles against neighbors." They shared concerning information. Patricia had raised HOA fees twice in the past year, citing legal contingencies. Board meeting minutes showed vague approvals for community expansion initiatives without specific details provided to members. "We think she's using HOA funds to pursue her husband's development interests," Robert explained. "He works for Platinum Ridge Developers, the company that built Willowbrook and is now buying surrounding properties." This connection explained Patricia's aggressive tactics. It wasn't just HOA overreach, it was a coordinated effort to pressure farmers into selling to her husband's company. As we talked, a familiar black SUV cruised slowly past the farm stand. Patricia didn't stop, but her expression through the window conveyed clear disapproval at seeing her residents fraternizing with the enemy. That night, reviewing the day's events, I realized the conflict had fundamentally changed. What began as a dispute over a demolished bridge had evolved into a defense of my entire farm's existence. Patricia wasn't just trying to control my property's appearance. She was systematically working to make farming untenable, forcing a sale to her husband's development company. The stakes had risen dramatically, and so had the forces aligned on both sides. As I wrote detailed notes in my case journal, my phone buzzed with a security alert. The camera footage showed 2 figures moving along my property line in the darkness, placing additional survey stakes even deeper into my land. The escalation had taken a new turn, and morning would reveal just how far Patricia was willing to go. The security footage of nighttime trespassers demanded immediate action. First thing the next morning, I called Officer Reynolds and reported the incident, emailing him the video files showing two figures placing additional survey stakes on my property. "I can clearly identify Patricia Wilkinson," I explained as he reviewed the footage on his tablet. "The man with her appears to be Richard Wilkinson, her husband." Reynolds nodded. "Face is visible when he turns toward the camera. We can compare with his driver's license photo." He walked the property line with me, documenting each new stake. These were placed nearly 30 feet into my land, even more aggressive than the previous markers. "This goes beyond civil trespassing," he noted. "They're systematically attempting to redefine property boundaries. That could constitute criminal fraud." While Officer Reynolds completed his report, I made a crucial decision. It was time to install a comprehensive security system. By noon, I had a local company setting up additional cameras covering every approach to my farm, with particular focus on the Willowbrook boundary. "Motion sensors, night vision, and cloud backup," the technician explained. "If anyone steps foot on your property, you'll know immediately." With security in place, I turned my attention to understanding my adversaries better. Patricia's husband's connection to Platinum Ridge developers warranted deeper investigation. At the county records office, Margaret helped me research Platinum Ridge's activities. They've purchased 6 family farms in the county over the past 3 years, she explained, spreading property transfer documents across the table, all adjacent to existing developments, all following similar patterns. The pattern was revealing. First came complaints about farm operations from neighboring developments, then code enforcement visits. Property tax reassessments often followed. Finally, farms would sell for below-market values. "Look at the signing parties," Margaret pointed out. Richard Wilkinson's signature appeared on every purchase agreement as Platinum Ridge's acquisition director. "And here's something interesting," she added, pulling another file. "Patricia Wilkinson is listed as a community relations consultant for Platinum Ridge. She receives $5,000 monthly, according to their registered contracts with the county." This wasn't just a husband-wife team. It was a documented a relationship. Patricia wasn't merely helping her husband. She was being paid to acquire properties through her HOA influence. "Is that legal?" I asked. "It's a clear conflict of interest if she's using HOA authority to devalue properties her company wants to purchase," Margaret replied, "especially if HOA funds are being used in the process." The findings necessitated expanding my investigation. I called Robert Inoue, who had offered to help from within Willowbrook. "I need to understand how the HOA finances these operations," I explained. "The bridge removal, the surveyors, the legal maneuvers, it all costs money." "I've been wondering." "The same thing," Robert replied. "As architecture committee chair, I see project approvals but not detailed financials. Let me talk to our treasurer." 2 days later, Robert called back with alarming information. "Our HOA budget shows $125,000 allocated for community boundary protection this year. That's nearly triple last year's legal budget, with no specific explanation provided to members." "Who approved this increase?" "The board voted during an executive session. Minimal documentation, no homeowner input. Patricia pushed it through as a security necessity." Robert had more. "I spoke with our treasurer confidentially. She's uncomfortable with recent financial directions, but felt pressured to approve Patricia's requests. Apparently, there's a separate account for special projects that only Patricia and the vice president can access. This suggested potential financial impropriety beyond the trespassing and property damage." I relayed this information to Morgan, who immediately expanded our legal strategy. "We need to subpoena those financial records," she said. "If they're using HOA funds for Patricia's personal agenda or her husband's development company, that's misappropriation and breach of fiduciary duty." My investigation next led me to the contractors who removed my bridge. Precision contractors operated from an industrial park across town. Rather than confronting them directly, I observed their yard from a public parking lot, photographing their equipment. Sure enough, the distinctive yellow excavator that appeared in my security footage sat in their yard. More tellingly, a truck with Platinum Ridge Developers logo was parked beside the company office. I researched precision contractors online and discovered Richard Wilkinson was listed as a minority owner. Another connection. The contractor who destroyed my bridge was partially owned by the same man trying to acquire my farm. That evening, I consolidated my findings into a comprehensive report: Patricia's paid relationship with Platinum Ridge, the HOA's suspicious financial allocations, Richard's ownership stake in the contracting company, and the pattern of farm acquisitions following similar harassment tactics. The picture was becoming clear. This was a systematic operation using HOA authority as a weapon to pressure property owners into selling to a development company, as IBA. Finished documenting everything, my phone buzzed with a text from Robert. Emergency HOA meeting called for tomorrow night. Agenda includes legal action against boundary encroachment by adjacent farm operation. They're coming after you formally now. I forwarded the message to Morgan, who responded immediately. Perfect timing. Our injunction hearing is the morning. After, let them show their hand first. That night, my new security system proved its worth. At 11:43 p.m., my phone alerted me to movement along the property line. The crystal-clear footage showed Patricia and two men I didn't recognize examining my newly installed cameras before retreating to Willowbrook property. They hadn't trespassed this time, but their nighttime reconnaissance confirmed they were planning something significant. The investigation had yielded crucial information just in time. Patricia Wilkinson wasn't merely an overzealous HOA president. She was a paid operative for a development company using her authority to systematically target neighboring properties. With the emergency HOA meeting approaching, I needed to prepare for their next move while organizing my evidence for the injunction hearing. The conspiracy was larger and more calculated than I had initially imagined, but now I understood exactly what I was fighting. I arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early, reviewing strategy with Morgan one final time before our injunction hearing. We had compiled 3 binders of evidence: property records, security footage, financial documentation, and witness statements, all supporting our request for emergency protection against further HOA encroachment. Remember, today we're only asking the court to prevent them from entering your property or claiming any portion of it while the main case proceeds, Morgan explained. We're not arguing the full bridge destruction case yet. Judge Eleanor Harmon, a no-nonsense veteran of the bench with a reputation for strict property rights interpretation, studied our materials with methodical precision. Across the aisle, the HOA's attorney, a polished corporate lawyer from the city, looked surprised by the volume of evidence we'd presented. Your Honor, Morgan began, my client seeks immediate injunctive relief from ongoing trespass and fraudulent boundary claims by Willowbrook Estates HOA and its president, Patricia Wilkinson, who has repeatedly entered Ms. Mitchell's property without permission, removed a critical access bridge and placed false survey markers in a systematic attempt to claim portions of my client's farm. The HOA attorney countered with arguments about community aesthetic standards and disputed boundaries, but faltered when Judge Harmon asked him to produce any documentation showing HOA authority beyond their recorded plat map. Are you suggesting, the judge asked pointedly, that an HOA can simply decide to extend its jurisdiction beyond legally recorded boundaries based on aesthetic preferences? The development's master plan always envisioned this area as part of, he began. I didn't ask about visions, Counselor. I asked about legal authority, Judge Harmon interrupted. Does Willowbrook Estates have any recorded easements, purchased, rights or jurisdictional agreements regarding Miss Mitchell's property? His silence was telling. After 90 minutes of arguments, Judge Harmon granted our emergency injunction, prohibiting any Willowbrook representatives from entering my property or asserting control over any portion of it. Additionally, she ordered all survey stakes removed and prohibited any further claims to my land pending resolution of the main case. The court finds substantial evidence of improper boundary assertions and unauthorized entry, she stated. This injunction will remain in effect until final judgment in the underlying matter. Outside the courthouse, Morgan grinned. This is just the beginning, but it's a significant victory. They can't legally set foot on your property now without risking contempt charges. That afternoon, I implemented the second phase of our counterattack strategy. With help from the Farmers United group, we organized a Farm Heritage Day at my property, inviting local media, agricultural officials, and community members to tour the farm and learn about its history, including the recently destroyed historics. Bridge. The event was scheduled for Saturday, guaranteeing maximum visibility. Simon Chen helped coordinate, bringing his farmers' market connections to create a true community gathering. Nothing counters development pressure like public support, he explained as we mapped out stations around my farm. Let's show everyone what they stand to lose if places like yours disappear. Meanwhile, Robert and his concerned Willowbrook residents launched their own initiative, a formal petition demanding a special audit of HOA finances and full disclosure of all contracts with Platinum Ridge developers. They needed signatures, from 30% of homeowners to force the review. We're already at 23%, Robert reported. Patricia's getting nervous. She called an emergency board meeting to discuss divisive community elements tomorrow night. Our multi-front approach was gaining momentum. The injunction provided legal protection, the Farm Heritage event would build public support, and the internal HOA investigation threatened to expose Patricia's conflicts of interest. The next crucial step was addressing the financial relationship between Patricia, the HOA, and Platinum Ridge. Morgan filed motions to compel disclosure of all financial records, contracts, and communications between these entities. Follow the money, she advised. If HOA funds were used to damage your property while Patricia was being paid by a company that would benefit from devaluing your farm, that's textbook self-dealing and potentially criminal misappropriation. On Thursday morning, our strategy faced its first serious counterattack. I received certified letters from both the HOA's attorney and Platinum Ridge developers. The HOA letter threatened a defamation lawsuit for false accusations of impropriety, while Platinum Ridge claimed, I was interfering with legitimate business relationships. Morgan was unfazed. Standard intimidation tactics. They're trying to scare you before Saturday's public event. That evening, I noticed increased activity around the Willowbrook clubhouse, cars coming and going late into the night. Robert texted around midnight. Emergency executive session ran for hours. Patricia looked furious, leaving. Something's happening. Friday morning revealed their desperate move. A billboard-sized sign appeared at the entrance to Willowbrook Estates. Protect our community from agricultural contamination. Say no to irresponsible farming practices. Accompanying the sign were glossy flyers distributed to every Willowbrook home, featuring doctored photos of my farm with exaggerated piles of waste and warnings about water contamination, odors, and property value decline. The flyers, specifically, discouraged residents from attending the propaganda event at Mitchell Farm. They're panicking, Morgan observed when I sent her photos. This borders on libel. I contacted James at the Agricultural Extension Office, who immediately arranged for the county environmental officer to inspect my farm that afternoon. By evening, I had official documentation confirming my farm met or exceeded all environmental standards, with no contamination threats whatsoever. With this certification in hand, I drafted a simple, factual response flyer. Mitchell Family Farm, 80 years of environmental stewardship. It outlined our sustainable practices, included the county's certification, and cordially invited all neighbors to Saturday's education event. Simon and 5 other farmers helped distribute these to Willowbrook homes that night, a direct counter to Patricia's misinformation campaign. Meanwhile, Robert's petition reached the critical 30% threshold, officially triggering a financial review. More significantly, he discovered something in the HOA bylaws that Patricia had likely overlooked. Any board member with an undisclosed financial conflict of interest could be immediately removed by member vote. If we could prove Patricia's paid relationship with Platinum Ridge while she directed HOA actions against my farm, she could be ousted from her position before the main legal case even concluded. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather and unexpected news. the local newspaper, had run a front-page story titled, "Family Farm Fights Controversial HOA Expansion." The reporter had investigated independently after hearing about our event, uncovering many of the same connections we'd documented. By 10 a.m., cars lined my driveway for Farm Heritage Day. Over 200 people attended, including dozens of Willowbrook, residents who had chosen to see for themselves despite Patricia's warnings. County officials, agricultural representatives, and 3 local TV stations covered the event. I led tours showing sustainable farming practices, explaining the bridge's historical significance, and demonstrating how its destruction had impacted farm operations. Many visitors expressed outrage upon seeing the demolished crossing and hearing the full story. "I had no idea this was happening," one Willowbrook resident told a reporter. "We bought here because we loved the rural character. We don't want to destroy it." From my property, we could see Patricia watching from the Willowbrook boundary, surrounded by a dwindling group of supporters. Her counterattack had backfired spectacularly, bringing more attention to her actions instead of suppressing them. By day's end, our event had generated substantial public support. The HOA financial audit was officially underway, and 3 more Willowbrook board members had privately approached Robert, expressing concerns about Patricia's leadership. The momentum had shifted decisively. What began as my defensive response to a destroyed bridge had evolved into a community-wide movement, questioning the unchecked power of development interests hiding behind HOA authority. As the last visitors departed, Morgan called with an update. "The judge has expedited our case based on new evidence, and Platinum Ridge's attorney contacted me about exploring resolution options." Our counterattack was working. For the first time since discovering my demolished bridge, I felt the balance of power shifting in my favor. The manila envelope arrived by courier Monday morning marked "Confidential Legal Documents." Inside were 50 pages of internal Willowbrook Estates communications, board meeting minutes, and financial records, along with a handwritten note, "You need to see this. I can't be identified." The handwriting matched the HOA treasurer's signature on official documents. I called Morgan immediately. "Someone from inside the HOA just sent us their confidential records." "Bring everything to my office now," she instructed. "Don't discuss this with anyone else." An hour later, we spread the documents across Morgan's conference table, methodically organizing them by date. What emerged was a damning timeline of calculated overreach and deception. The earliest document, a private email from Patricia dated 18 months ago, stated, "Mitchell property essential for Phase 3. Owner resistant to initial inquiries. Alternative acquisition strategies required." More emails followed, revealing a coordinated campaign targeting my farm. One from Patricia to Platinum Ridge executives read, "Survey shows 87% of homeowners would support expansion if current farm operations were presented as detrimental to community values." Most shocking was an internal strategy document titled "Boundary Enhancement Initiative," detailing a 3-phase approach. Document and exaggerate negative aesthetic impacts from adjacent properties. Begin enforcement actions regardless of actual jurisdiction. Create perception of inevitable development to depress property values. "This is extraordinary," Morgan said, carefully photographing each page. They've documented their own conspiracy. The financial records were equally revealing. Willowbrook's HOA had paid precision contractors $14,700 for perimeter beautification, the exact company that demolished my bridge. The payment was authorized solely by Patricia and the vice president, bypassing standard board approval processes. Another document showed a $50,000 transfer from Platinum Ridge to the HOA for community enhancement, just 2 weeks before my bridge was removed. This money wasn't reported in the standard HOA financial statements distributed to members. Most damning was a property acquisition timeline listing neighboring farms with target purchase dates and maximum offering prices. My farm appeared with the notation, "Value reduction strategy in progress. Estimate 30% below market acquisition by Q4. They were never interested in aesthetic concerns, I realized. The bridge removal was deliberately designed to make my farm operations untenable and force me to sell. Morgan nodded grimly. This goes beyond HOA overreach. It's conspiracy, fraud, and potential racketeering. The financial transfers create a paper trail of coordinated action. As we continued reviewing documents, another revelation emerged. A boundary survey commissioned by Willowbrook but never disclosed to residents clearly showed my property lines exactly where my deed indicated. They had known precisely where their authority ended, yet had proceeded with their encroachment regardless. They deliberately misrepresented their boundaries, Morgan said. This completely undermines their claim of a good-faith boundary dispute. The most recent documents showed growing panic as our counteroffensive gained momentum. An email from Patricia to board members warned, "Essential to maintain unified front regarding Mitchell situation. All communications must emphasize community protection narrative." Another to Platinum Ridge executives was more candid. "Situation deteriorating. Accelerate acquisition offer before full financial disclosure unavoidable." By afternoon, Morgan had incorporated these documents into our legal strategy, filing amended complaints adding fraud, conspiracy, and illegal financial transactions to our claims. She also requested an emergency hearing based on this new evidence. "These documents change everything," she explained. "We're no longer just seeking compensation for the bridge. We're exposing a systematic scheme to defraud property owners." That evening, I received a call from Robert. "Something's happening at the HOA office. Emergency board meeting called with outside counsel present." The next morning brought the first public indication of internal fracturing. 3 Willowbrook board members issued a joint statement, distancing themselves from certain unauthorized actions taken regarding neighboring properties and announcing an independent audit of all HOA finances and contracts. By noon, local news was reporting that Patricia had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The vice president issued a statement citing serious concerns about procedural irregularities, but providing no specifics. The courthouse was unusually busy when we arrived for our emergency hearing the following day. Judge Harmon's courtroom was packed with observers, including several Willowbrook residents and county officials. Patricia was conspicuously absent, represented only by the HOA's increasingly uncomfortable attorney. When Morgan presented the leaked documents, he made only perfunctory objections about their provenance. Judge Harmon reviewed the evidence with growing concern. "These documents suggest a coordinated effort to undermine legitimate property rights through fraudulent means," she noted. "The court finds sufficient evidence to expand the existing injunction." Her amended order prohibited any Willowbrook representative from making public statements about my farm, required immediate removal of all defamatory signage, and froze the Community Enhancement Fund pending full investigation. As we left the courthouse, a reporter approached with an unexpected question. "Can you comment on Patricia Wilkinson's resignation from the HOA board?" This was news to us. Morgan skillfully deflected while I checked my phone, finding multiple messages from Robert confirming the development. Patricia had resigned that morning, citing personal reasons and hostile community elements. Back at Morgan's office, we learned more details from Robert. The financial audit uncovered extensive irregularities. Patricia had been operating a separate account for special projects with almost no oversight. When confronted, she resigned rather than face questions. The revelation extended beyond Patricia's departure. County investigators had opened an inquiry into Platinum Ridge's development practices based on the documents we'd submitted to the court. Richard Wilkinson had taken an immediate leave of absence from the company. That evening, I walked along my creek to the destroyed bridge site, contemplating how thoroughly the situation had transformed. What began as a simple property violation had exposed a complex web of corruption and fraud, reaching into corporate development and community governance. My phone rang, an unknown number. "Ms. Mitchell? This is David Cooper, interim president of Willowbrook Estates HOA. His voice sounded tentative, nothing like Patricia's confident assertions. "I'd like to discuss resolving our situation, perhaps with your attorney present." "I think that would be appropriate," I replied carefully. "The board has reviewed your original bridge designs. We believe a full restoration would be a reasonable starting point for discussion. The tide had turned completely. From demolishing my bridge to offering to rebuild it, all because their scheme had been exposed. As I ended the call, I noticed something unexpected on the Willowbrook side of the creek. The provocative development sign had been removed, leaving only disturbed soil where it had stood. The full extent of Patricia's scheme had been revealed, and with it came the first real possibility of justice and restoration. The HOA that had once seemed untouchable was now in disarray, its leadership expelled, its actions under investigation. Tomorrow would bring negotiations and continuing legal proceedings, but today's revelations had fundamentally altered the balance of power. The truth had emerged, and it had proven more powerful than all of Patricia's manipulations combined. The Willowbrook Estates clubhouse felt different without Patricia's commanding presence. Gone were the intimidating portraits of perfect homes and manicured landscapes. Instead, the conference room held a subdued group of board members looking distinctly uncomfortable. David Cooper, the interim president, greeted Morgan and me with an awkward handshake. "Thank you for agreeing to meet here," he said. "We thought it important to host this discussion on our territory, so to speak, a gesture of accountability." Beside him sat the HOA's new attorney, Susan Chen, who had replaced their aggressive corporate lawyer. The remaining board members, including Robert, who had been appointed to fill a vacancy, completed the group. Morgan had prepared me thoroughly for this negotiation. "They're vulnerable, but don't push too hard initially," she had advised. "Let them present their offer first." Cooper cleared his throat, his tie. "We wish to express our sincere regret for the unauthorized removal of your bridge and the subsequent complications. The current board is committed to making this right." Chen slid a document folder across the table. "We're prepared to offer a comprehensive settlement package." Morgan and I reviewed their proposal. Complete restoration of the bridge to its original specifications, $75,000 in damages for trespass and lost farm productivity, and a formal written apology to be published in the local newspaper. "This is a starting point," I said after conferring quietly with Morgan, "but it doesn't address the broader issues uncovered during our investigation." "Broader issues?" Cooper looked nervous. "The documented conspiracy between Patricia Wilkinson, Platinum Ridge developers, and certain board members to devalue my property and pressure me to sell," I explained calmly. "The misappropriation of HOA funds for this purpose, the defamation campaign against my farm." Chen interjected smoothly. "The board is prepared to acknowledge certain procedural irregularities, but we cannot accept legal responsibility for actions taken by individual members, potentially exceeding their authority." "Procedural irregularities?" Morgan raised an eyebrow. "The documents show a coordinated campaign funded by both HOA resources and external developer contributions. That goes well beyond individual actions." I opened my laptop and pulled up photos of the bridge's destruction. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a calculated attack on my livelihood as part of a larger development strategy. For the next hour, we methodically worked through each aspect of the situation. The board initially resisted acknowledging the full scope of wrongdoing, but with each document we referenced, their position weakened. "We're prepared to increase the financial compensation to $125,000, Cooper finally offered. "But we need assurances. This matter will be fully resolved, including any claims against individual board members." Morgan shook her head. "Our client isn't interested in pursuing current board members who weren't directly involved. However, Patricia Wilkinson and those actively participating in the scheme cannot be included in any release of liability." This sparked intense discussion among the board members. They clearly wanted to put the entire situation behind them, but separating the HOA's liability from Patricia's personal culpability complicated matters. "What specific terms would satisfy you?" Chen asked eventually. I had prepared for this question. "First, complete restoration of the bridge, built to modern specifications while maintaining its historical character. Second, compensation for all damages, including the harassment campaign and lost productivity. Third, a binding agreement establishing clear boundaries and prohibiting any future HOA claims over my property. Fourth, a public accounting of what occurred, including the relationship with Platinum Ridge. The fourth condition is problematic, Chen replied. A public accounting could expose the HOA to additional liability. Transparency is non-negotiable, I said firmly. The community deserves to know what was done in their name and with their money. Robert spoke up for the first time. She's right. Homeowners have been misled for years. We need to rebuild trust through complete transparency. The negotiation continued through lunch, with proposals and counter-proposals. By mid-afternoon, we had reached tentative agreement on most points. A new bridge constructed to enhanced specifications with a professional engineer's oversight. $150,000 in compensation for all damages and losses. A legally recorded easement document clarifying property boundaries and explicitly limiting HOA authority. A joint statement acknowledging the improper actions and detailing corrective measures. The sticking point remained the confidentiality clause. The HOA wanted to prohibit any discussion of the settlement terms or underlying events. Absolutely not, Morgan stated flatly. My client will not be silenced about what happened to her property. Perhaps a middle ground, Cooper suggested. Specific financial terms remain confidential, but the factual events and corrective actions can be disclosed. After consulting privately, Morgan and I agreed this was acceptable with one addition. I want to establish a legal defense fund for neighboring farmers facing similar development pressure, I explained. Using a portion of the settlement, this caused another round of discussion, but eventually they conceded. The HOA would contribute an additional $50,000 to establish a Rural Property Rights Protection Fund administered by the County Agricultural Extension Office. As evening approached, we had a framework agreement in principle. Legal teams would draft the formal settlement documents over the coming week. There's one more matter, I said as we prepared to conclude. The contractors are scheduled to begin bridge reconstruction next Monday. I'll need full access granted through Willowbrook property until completion, as it's the only viable equipment route with the bridge gone. Cooper nodded. We'll issue authorization immediately and notify all homeowners. As we departed, Robert walked us to our cars. Patricia's being investigated by the district attorney, he said quietly. The financial transactions crossed several legal lines. Platinum Ridge is distancing themselves completely, claiming she acted without their knowledge. Morgan smiled. Justice takes many forms. Driving home along the winding country road, I reflected on how thoroughly the power dynamic had shifted. The HOA that once demolished my property with impunity was now funding its restoration and establishing protections for other farmers. The bridge would return stronger than before. My farm would continue operating as it had for generations, and perhaps most importantly, a precedent had been set, a clear message that even the most powerful HOAs couldn't simply override property rights without consequences. Tomorrow would bring the settlement paperwork and bridge reconstruction plans. But today had brought something equally important, accountability. 3 months after the negotiations, I stood on my new bridge, admiring how the morning sun glinted off the creek below. The structure was a perfect blend of traditional design and modern engineering. Pressure-treated oak planks, supported by reinforced concrete footings and steel beams, all carefully crafted to honor my grandfather's original vision while providing decades of reliable service. The craftsmanship was impeccable, with a plaque discreetly mounted at the entrance reading, "Mitchell Farm Bridge, Preserving Agricultural Heritage." No mention of the controversy that had led to its reconstruction, but those who knew the story understood its significance. The settlement had been finalized 2 weeks after our negotiation, with terms largely matching our framework agreement. The HOA had fulfilled its financial obligations promptly, eager to put the entire situation behind them. My farm operations had returned to normal, with the new bridge actually improving efficiency with its wider design and higher weight capacity. But the resolution extended far beyond physical restoration. The case had triggered significant changes throughout the community. The Willowbrook Estates HOA had undergone a complete leadership transformation. Following Patricia's resignation and subsequent legal troubles, the entire governance structure was reformed. Robert now served as vice president under David Cooper's measured leadership, with a new set of bylaws explicitly limiting HOA authority to its actual boundaries and requiring supermajority approval for any legal actions against non-members. More importantly, the $50,000 Rural Property Rights Protection Fund had already assisted 2 neighboring farmers facing development pressure. When a different HOA attempted similar tactics against Simon Chen's vegetable farm, the fund provided immediate legal representation, shutting down the encroachment before it escalated. Patricia and Richard Wilkinson had sold their Willowbrook home and relocated to another state, but they couldn't escape the consequences of their actions. The district attorney had filed financial fraud charges against Patricia based on the misappropriation of HOA funds. Richard faced separate investigations into Platinum Ridge's business practices, with several development projects now under regulatory scrutiny. Platinum Ridge itself had abandoned plans for Phase 3 expansion, selling its land options to a conservation trust that established a permanent agricultural easement on several properties bordering Willowbrook, including a strip adjacent to my farm. This buffer zone ensured that working farms and residential developments could coexist with clear boundaries and mutual respect. The morning's reflection was interrupted by the sound of approaching vehicles. Today marked another milestone in the resolution, the first official Farm Community Cooperation Day, jointly sponsored by local agricultural organizations and the Willowbrook HOA. Robert arrived first, followed by several carloads of Willowbrook residents. "Ready for the big day?" he asked, surveying the education stations we had set up around the farm. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied. "Honestly, I never imagined hosting an HOA-sponsored event on my property," he laughed. "Life takes unexpected turns. Half our residents now list adjacent to preserved farmland as their favorite community feature." The event had grown from a simple idea into something more meaningful, a structured opportunity for urban and rural neighbors to understand each other's perspectives. Stations around my farm demonstrated sustainable agricultural practices, explained the economic importance of family farms, and highlighted how traditional farming could complement modern residential communities. Willowbrook residents contributed their own expertise, with gardening demonstrations, water conservation workshops, and discussions about responsible land stewardship from a homeowner's perspective. Children ran excitedly between animal pens while their parents asked thoughtful questions about farming methods. Several older Willowbrook residents shared stories of growing up on farms themselves, creating unexpected connections with their rural neighbors. Midway through the morning, David Cooper called for everyone's attention at the center of the gathering. "Today represents more than just a neighborly event," he began. "It's the culmination of a journey that began with conflict but ends with cooperation. We've learned valuable lessons about respecting boundaries, both physical and jurisdictional." He gestured toward me. "Emma Mitchell taught us that standing firm for one's rights doesn't preclude building bridges, literal and figurative, between different ways of life." The county commissioner spoke next, announcing a new rural residential advisory council that would bring farmers and homeowners associations together to address concerns before they escalated into conflicts. I had agreed to serve as its first agricultural representative, with Robert representing residential interests. As the formal speeches concluded, an elderly Willowbrook resident approached me. "I voted for removing your bridge," she admitted quietly. "Patricia convinced us it was unsightly and lowered our property values. Now I understand it was the connection between your home and livelihood. I'm sorry." Her sincere apology represented the most meaningful aspect of the resolution, genuine understanding replacing fear and misconception. By afternoon, visitors had spread throughout the farm, many crossing the new bridge to explore fields they once viewed only from a distance. The structure that Patricia had deemed an eyesore had become a symbol of connection between different lifestyles. As sunset approached and the event wound down, I walked the property with Simon Chen and several other farmers who had supported me throughout the ordeal. "You've created something important here," Simon observed. "Not just protecting your own farm, but establishing that HOAs can't simply override property rights wherever they please. The precedent matters, agreed Maria Gutierrez. Every farmer in the county knows now. You don't have to sell just because development creeps closer. Later, after all the visitors had departed, I sat alone on my porch watching fireflies dance above the fields my grandfather had cultivated. The bridge stood silhouetted against the twilight, stronger and more beautiful than its predecessor. The conflict had been painful, the battle exhausting. But the resolution had created something I hadn't anticipated, a genuine community that respected boundaries while building connections. My farm remained intact, my property rights secured, and the threat of unchecked development held at bay. Some bridges, once destroyed, can be rebuilt stronger than before, and sometimes the same is true of the communities they connect.